everyone's aware, which is nice and exciting as we get going on this lovely Monday morning. I'm going to give everyone a few moments to join, give Derek and Terrence. I don't see Terrence online, so he may not be joining us. He was feeling under the weather for a little bit, and I know he's got just a ton of stuff going on, so I do appreciate whenever anyone can join us for these. Terrence, not Darren's. Oh, that was a Derek joke. That was I get it. Say he's connecting two series with a connective word of sorts. Right, Jack? Is that a reference to the logic of sense? Yeah.
Yeah. The Portman's esoteric word.
Yeah. We got esoteric names, I suppose. But we will be moving today into the 8th series of Structure, which is going to be pretty, I think it's very interesting, personally, myself. We had a fun time discussing this last night. I'm still trying to pull up my stupid notes. There they are. And it is a shorter section, and so I think we're going to spend more time having sort of chats through what a couple of these things, like the implications of them, and I'm jazzed for what today's going to bring. Before I sort of get underway and get anything going, I'll go ahead and do the normal intro, say hi, and then if anyone has any, one second, let me make sure everyone can join the channel. Yeah, everyone can join. We'll get into announcements in a second. Should I give parents a few minutes or anyone else a few minutes to join before I dive in? Yeah, we usually give everyone a few moments. People straggle in. It takes a little bit. I also, on one note, because I know it was kind of how we ended the recording last week, my diatribe about the process of how we understand words and how we eventually utilize the 3 syntheses in different orders depending on an esoteric word or not. I'm actually writing a thing on that and trying to vocalize my thoughts on that very cleanly. And so at some point I may annoy a handful of you to look over that and tell me if I'm completely out of my mind, which will be fun, I think. So it's the nice part about this book, given how little secondary lit there is on it, and the stuff that is written about it is really just about helping people sort of grasp the underlying things, but not really expanding on it. There's a lot of room to play, and I intend to take advantage of that as much as possible, to say the least. So that should be pretty exciting. But it looks like this is going to be our group, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So as always, thank you for coming to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we are moving into Series 8, that of Structure, which, to hear Deleuze talk about structure itself as a thing, it's an interesting one, and so I'm looking forward to diving into it. Before I do, I have a quick few things. As always, you can find us on social media, D&GQC on Twitter, DGQC on Patreon if you want to support what we're doing. Every buck counts. We're breaking even, and it's wonderful. I'm not going to turn down being able to put a couple bucks towards advertising and getting our name out there a little bit, and maybe doing a couple other really cool things. So we'll see what happens with that. Any announcements with any of the groups that we want to get going right now? We'll start with Jack. I know every week we have a literature announcement. So
yeah, a unique one this week because we're going to be doing a roundtable, having finished our series looking at the author in Barth's Death of the Author, Bakhtin in Art and Answerability, and Foucault's What is an Author? So we'll be having just a more... I'm not going to say there's no test because you're encouraged to look those over before you attend, but there's no assigned reading for this week on Saturday, noon PDT. I should also announce for the Guattari group that we are still reading The Machinic Unconscious, so join us for that. Friday, 5 p.m. PST.
excellent. And Kent, anything? I mean, there's a ton of stuff I know going on between here and the Continental Philosophy server. Any major new stuff we want to mention?
Well, there's Zizek's Sex and the Failed Absolute. We're on Corollary 3. That's on Wednesdays at noon. And then Heidegger, Introduction to Metaphysics, is on Friday at 4 p.m. Both of those times are Pacific Daylight Time.
All right. Any other major things, any notes before we dive into the structure of propositions and words and language? All right. Excellent. So, as I said, we're moving into the 8th series of structure. This is a fascinating one because up until this point, please tell me if anyone disagrees with this. Up till this point, we've been breaking down sort of the elements that are part of series, how series work. We have, the homogeneous series of propositions, how propositions themselves are sort of set up, and how their structure or their machinic parts sort of operate. And now we're getting into actually the structure of language and how they sort of come to be. And I found it really interesting to sort of read through this because, again, anytime Deleuze is talking about structure or really clearly starts chasing after it, I find it fascinating. One of the things I wanted to sort of start off with is the first little bit here about the Levi-Strauss paradox, the antinomy, he says, where you have, to quote, two series being given, one signifying, the other signified. The first presents an excess, the latter a lack. The idea being that when you have two series that are going to be essentially juxtaposed against each other, or that we're sort of dealing with, you have one that is the signifier, one that is the signified. The way that they operate puts the two series in a natural disequilibrium and has a natural space between them. Because on the one hand, you have the signifier, the idea or conception, or they represent the large-scale representation or totality. I think they would later go on to maybe say the term the body without organs of sorts, the full body perhaps. But then on the other hand, you have the signified, which is the parts of things as they happen, sort of the particulars, the little bits. It was a really interesting sort of start. So my question that I had, and I wanted to sort of kick off with, is that even close? Because we went down a little bit of a rabbit hole last night as we kept talking through this, and the way that they start using and talking about signifiers, signified, and then floating signifiers and signifieds is going to get really confusing, and so I want to try to break this down, and I want to start there. Is that a fair place?
Sure.
So, am I far off in how I'm sort of talking about this? The totalizing knowledge of how language sort of operates. The example I used last night, and I think Cold Circle had their own. Mine was, there's a moment in my son's life, and I think every child has this, where they move, and you can tell when it happens, when they move from saying sounds to saying words. Despite it being effectively the same noise that's coming out, there is absolutely a different moment. And in that moment where he began saying words and engaging that conversation, in that moment, all of language as a sort of system, as a thing, was something he simply stepped into as a sort of totality. Where despite this small number of words he may know, or how they connect, or anything like that, this felt like a good way to sort of explain the totalizing nature of language. And we went back and forth on this, but I wanted to throw it out there and see if there were thoughts.
Yeah, I think my understanding of it was that we have language, as you say, as a totality, which is, but then the opposite. So that's one side of the series. That's one series, one side of the paradox. Then the other side. What is the other side? And I think the other side is nature. And he says we're given language as a totality, but we're not given nature as a totality. We get it part by part, and he uses that phrase partes extra partes. So it's that kind of relationship. So one is given in totality, and the thing we direct language towards is the world as knowledge. So it's how we know things in terms of knowledge, but we we don't have that as a totality, but we kind of build that up.
Yeah. So then, because I'm trying to just break it down, because this gets, by the end of this series, despite only being 4 pages, I found it confusing, and so I wanted to just really break that down. The totality versus as it's being used in this paragraph versus the part by part. The totality is the concept of language, or taking part in that entire system of it by utilizing words to communicate is a way that we talk to each other. That's root language, big thing, giant bubble. The actual words, or the signifieds that are part of that, are the nature of it, the things I actually can experience one at a time, the things I do, the things I process, literally them, the direct bodies, rather than the. Is that close?
I'm not sure if you should say the concept of language. That implies for me anyway, a kind of a detachment from language. I think it's language itself. We have language, but he says it's of the order of language. So I think perhaps within language, I'm not sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think that quote from Levi Strauss at the end of that paragraph kind of sums it up a little bit. So the universe. So instead of nature, he talks about the universe signifying, and he says man has a completeness of signifier at his disposal, which is language, which is obstructed from allocating to the signified. So he's saying, so this is the kind of paradox, I think, between the two. I think the paradox between language, which we have at our disposal, so it's a completeness of signifier, and the universe, the world around us, which signifies, but we're kind of obstructed from from applying the language to the world, or to the universe, as Levi Strauss says. And then in the second paragraph, the notion of language is law. So it's he talks about the figure of the law weighing with all its might. So I think that's the image of justice with a blindfold holding scales.
Right. So okay.
It's always weighing.
The idea of having law, like being within we live in a society, whatever, however memey you want to put it, but like law itself as a thing weighs with all of its might. However, the signifieds are the policies, the actual ways that we directly engage it in a material sense. Is the signifieds?
I think you're saying law will always weigh, so it will always want to be exercise justice, but without really knowing what it's, without always knowing what it's actually weighing in the balance,
Well, so what would be the signified in that space?
He says without its object becoming exactly known. So, I mean, he talks about all the rules and laws which are implicated. So he translates the Levi Strauss paradox into what he calls the Robinson's paradox. So Robinson Crusoe in his island he wants to create a kind of what he calls an analog society on this desert island, but he has all the rules and laws all at once because he has language. He has them all at once. So he has them all. So then he has to make the island, the structure of the island, conform to all that he has, all this understanding, all this knowledge. Language he has, which is embodied in language. But he says that. But he says the conquest of nature is, on the contrary, progressive, partial, advances step by step. So it can't all be applied at once.
I'm going to cut in for just a moment because Deleuze has a very particular meaning when we're talking about signifiers and signifieds in this book. And I just want to recall the definition he gives. This is from the Sit series on serialization, page 37. He writes, "The law governing two simultaneous series is that they are never equal. One represents the signifier, the other the signified. But thanks to our terminology, these two terms acquire a particular meaning. We call signifier any sign which presents in itself an aspect of sense. We call signified, on the contrary, that which serves as the correlative to this aspect of sense, that is, that which is defined in a duality relative to this aspect. What is signified, therefore, is never sense itself. In a restrained sense, signified is the concept. In an extended sense, signified is anything which may be defined on the basis of the distinction that a certain aspect of sense establishes with this thing. Thus, the signifier is primarily the event as the ideal logical attribute of the state of affairs, and the signified is the state of affairs together with its qualities and real relations."
That doesn't help. I mean, it helps, but it's so the challenge becomes here for me, that having the chat around when we talk about signifier signified, and right here we're talking about the structure around this section is about the structure between them, how they combine, how they essentially how sense recognizes them. And how sense processes them, or how sense makes their way through it, is how this kind of ends. So as we start talking about the signifier signified, on the one side we have, we'll talk about language, we talk about law, we talk about these things that sort of exist as, he later uses the term implication, which I think is interesting as a, he used the term implicated here, the line being, it is obvious that Robinson, on his desert island, could reconstruct an analog of society only by giving himself, all at once, all the rules and laws which are reciprocally implicated, even when they still have no objects. Robinson on his island doesn't have judges. He's alone. Like, there's literally nothing there. And the sort of snarky joke he's making here is, even though that's the case, he still has law weighing on his head. He may never speak to anyone again. He still has language weighing on his head, because it is reciprocally implicated, despite not having the judge, the jury, the executioner, the jails, the other things that are essentially the parts of law. And I think the previous section here is, the previous paragraph is saying the same thing about language, that it almost doesn't matter. The universe signified long before we began to know what it was signifying. Man, since his origin, has had at his disposal a completeness of signifier, which he has obstructed from allocating to signified, given as such without being any better known. The nature of it is that these large, I shouldn't use the word concept, you're right, but language and law and, you know, these impossible to define aspects that are these gigantic signifiers, and they have their specifics, but those things have implications into themselves. They are implicated in the very nature of sort of their own existence. That's the nature of the signifier and signified relationship. What I'm trying to understand is how, when we have law, for example, as a signifier, what is the signified within law? I can't think of it other than it is literal laws, policies, the judge, the objects, which, am I far off?
I think for me, I think the idea is that the signifier is language, but it's in which signifier is society, which is constructed, which is a constructed thing, and it's constructed in terms of rules and laws, which are and society, and that's what's kind of imposed on the universe or nature. Let's call it nature, you know. So through the so we create society on one side, and society is an order which we impose upon nature. And I think those, and then I think because in the next bit he talks about this kind of notion of the revolution and the differences, the kind of revolutionary in the being in between two things. And I think it's this kind of he says something like the technocrat is the friend of the tyrant or something like that. And I think it's this thing of ordering nature. This is, I think, what the paradox is about. It's about the way in which we impose order onto nature, and what that gives off is society. So this is what Robinson on his island feels he needs to do, to create an analog of society through the rules and nature, which to get rules and laws which are reciprocally implicated, so they're given together, even when they have no objects, even when there's nothing to kind of impose them onto. And this is why he says law weighs with all its might. Law is the thing which justice, the figure of justice, will always weigh, even when it has nothing to weigh.
So is it the Socius from AO? Is this kind of the early? Is it the early parts of that? Because when we talk about the signifier, we talk about law, we talk about language, we talk about these giant representations, effectively, versus the direct connections and things I'm able to impart. Right? Robinson has his island, he has the law, and law as a thing feels like a Kafka-esque comment. Law as a thing is sort of waiting for him. He doesn't have jails, he doesn't have this stuff. I mean, over time, he kind of builds these structures up in order to sort of supplant those representations and to give signifiers signifieds that play inside of that. But that's where I'm trying to understand, because look, here's why it matters. We're about to start talking about the floating signifier, which is this thing that sort of sits on the edge between the two series, the signifier and the signified. And there's also a floating signified that sits opposing that. Being able to sort of map these things together, to me, is going to be pretty important. And I'm trying to figure out where to start with it. Where we had the notes from this is the signifier signified is the difference between, say, the Socius and desiring machines, it feels. How we recognize structuralism, great. I'm going to have to read that in a second. Sorry, Alyosha, unless you want to read it out and talk through it. No, excellent. Your mic is fair enough. But so it's, on the one side we have the law. Law is assumed as existing, that it is reciprocally implicated, as they say, as he says in here. Because we have this group, this society as a nature. But policy is the thing that we're doing right now, and over time we start doing part by part by part. It's the pieces that make up the law, the larger structure. Kent, do you have go ahead, Jack, or Kent.
I think it may help to back up here, because when you, I see where you're going with this, because if we were coming from an HR perspective, that's exactly what I would think too, right? Let's go to the policies, right? But in that first paragraph, Deleuze seems to be saying that there's this relationship of knowledge and language, or la langue, and I don't have background in des Saussure to get very deep into that. But I think this might help with your question, where he writes, but the signified in general is of the order of the known. So we're talking about language, and I think he used savoir earlier on. Anyways, but the signified in general is of the order of the known, though the known is subject to the law of progressive movement, which proceeds from one part to another. Partes extra partes, or part after part, as Derek was saying. And whatever totalizations knowledge may perform, they remain asymptotic to the virtual totality of langue or language. The series organizes a preliminary totality, whereas the signified series arranges the produced totalities. So already we're talking about totalities, right? Language has the capacity to organize what appear to be totalities, right? But there's also totalities in knowledge, and this relationship, fleshing that out a little bit more, might help us understand Robinson's paradox more directly.
I think we've already spoken a little bit about the relationship between two series. So they they approach each other, but then they kind of go away from each other. And I think this is what he means when he says, whatever totalizations knowledge may perform, they remain asymptotic, which is a word I'd never come across, to the virtual totality of language. And what that means basically is that knowledge, even though they come together, but they part away from it, they go away from each other. So this is the kind of paradox, so we have this means of signifying, i.e. language, and we have something we want to signify about, i.e. the universe or nature, but they never come together because the language is always this total, is given in total all at once, whereas the universe is something we need as knowledge, is something that's built up gradually and over time. So it's a constructed thing. So they kind of we want to signify, we want to apply our signification to the what's signifying, but we can't do it. And this, I think, is what Levi Strauss is talking about as being the paradox. And this is what he talks about Robinson's paradox, the same thing, So Robinson Crusoe lands on this deserted piece of nature, and he has with him all the means to construct this, what he calls an analog society. That the means are language, and he constructs it in rules and laws. But then he has to physically, work with nature directly to construct something that will kind of mirror that.
Well, and that's even where it seems to get a little strange, right? Because we do have this kind of nature and social right there, and yet immediately preceding that, right, like you pointed out earlier, is that Levi-Strauss quote, "The capital U universe." Of course, the universe signified long before we began to know what it was signifying. Man, since his origin, has at his disposal a completeness of signifier, which he has obstructed from allocating to a signified, given as such without being any better known. There is always an inadequacy between the two. So I think I agree with you, right? They never, signifier and signified don't converge, right? They don't touch each other. And yet they kind of move toward each other while also diverging from each other, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I think that's the nature of the series that we've gone through in the preceding series. He talks about that. So he says, when he talks about Lacan's, I take Lacan's paradox was to do with the letter that I did, that the two series, and there's always this thing that floats in between them, which we haven't got to yet. There's always something that kind of connects them in some way. So they never come together, but they're connected in some way, but by the abstract object, which I think was the letter, thing that was common to both of them.
Yeah, and it seems to be that. So you're talking about. I think we're getting into moving toward the differentiator, but before getting directly into that, right? The part that sticks out to me that I think he's expanding with the natural and the social there is this sentence: the signifying series organizes a preliminary totality, whereas the signified series arranges the produced totalities. So where we find signifiers, right, we're getting a series that's organized in a preliminary totality. And yet the signified series is rearranging that, or rather arranging it. So it's interesting to see, like we were just, in your example with nature and the social, right? It's interesting to see the social providing this all at one sense of language, but we're also seeing how nature there seems to be a relationship here that I think this can help us understand. Because I'm not sure if he's trying to say that nature has its signifiers, which society is like rearranging, right? So signifier, signified, respectively. Or if you don't find two sets within each of those altogether.
I think it might be useful to remember what Levi Strauss was. He was an anthropologist who studied so-called primitive societies. And he was interested in things like use of magic and things like that, in the way in which tribal societies understood the world around them, in the way in which they used different rituals, etc., to kind of engage with the world and the universe and nature.
So I'm going to jump a little bit because I'm having a harder time sort of flying back into that idea of this sort of concept of language and law as we're talking about it. It feels deeply transcendental rather than sort of not. And I just want to understand, are we talking about a transcendental type of language or law? Because, for example, in Robinson's paradox here, Robinson could construct an analog of society only by giving himself all at once all the rules and laws which are reciprocally implicated even when they have no objects. The natural assumption on my end is that Robinson's bringing what he understands as law, this sort of large-scale signifier that is the how to put it. It's a series of totalities that are completely dependent on their differential relations. It's the nature of the signifier, sort of at large. It has to be given all together when it's language. It's all the totalities at once. When it's law, it has to be given all at once. He gives particular sort of differential sort of relations in the examples of juridical, religious, political, economic, laws of love and labor, kinship, marriage, servitude, freedom, life, and death. Those are it's a signifying series in itself that is his Robinson's understanding of those things. The signified is the direct sort of the produced totalities, the way that they sort of have been evoked by him in that space on that island. The difference being, obviously, that there's a distance between his entire conception of law or language or religion or politics or economics, whatever it is, versus the thing he's actually able to do on the island. He's not able to have a judge, jury, executioner, and large-scale legal system with jails. Obviously, that's the signifier is the law, but he's able to make some do of it, and he does with, his own sort of version of that thing. It doesn't, replicate it wholly, but that's the piece-by-piece thing as he's moving through it. That's the signified series.
Yeah, that's right. I think so. He lands on his island, and he's got that totality. The laws are in the form of rules, which is, I take it is what Deleuze calls the order from the order of language. So the order of language is given in terms of rules, and as you said, juridical, religious, etc. And that is kind of projected onto. I would say it's kind of projected onto the island, and it's then the idea is to transform it, to make it conform to those rules, but then that becomes a difficulty, I would say. But that relationship between the rules and society and nature to create society is kind of developed further in the next paragraph, I suspect.
To me, it's developed further even in that paragraph where he says the issue with technocracy, as an example, he goes into is the idea that, hey, we have this idea of what laws should be, and we have, the only issue is we just can't make it. We just can't make it real, but technology is letting us make it real. And hey, well, as we make it, we use those things, and then those things become elevated as proof of progress and Reformism, I think, is the era of Reformism, which promotes or imposes partial arrangements of social relations according to the rhythm of technical achievements. That's the pieces I'm making as I go, look, this is getting better, and I can reform slightly how horrifying the loss in the signification is conceptually as a Reformism concept. It feels like he's going very deep right there because he's talking about there is this gap. The technocrat is the natural friend of the dictator, computers and dictatorship. But the revolutionary lives in that gap, which separates technical progress from social totality, and inscribes there his dream of permanent revolution. I have to say it because it's one of my favorite lines in the part. This dream, therefore, is itself action, reality, and an effective menace to all established order. It renders possible what it dreams about. This space of the edge of what we're able to make and what the sort of horizon is, that other thing, is where we're able to sort of actually make those changes, because we're no longer living directly in structure. We're also no longer living directly in the piece by piece. It feels like that's what he's driving at there. No.
I think we gotta walk out this relationship just a little bit more, at least for me, because the law, I think what he's getting at is the law seems to be caught up in the signifying function, which means that it's arranging what the signifiers encountered, right? And that's interesting, because if that's the case, general to the order of the known. Oh boy, not enough sleep.
So I'd like to just comment that this idea that the law is given all at once, that's the traditional idea that comes from Solon, who gave the laws to Athens all at once and then left the city so people couldn't try to get him to change them. So that's a traditional idea. But the idea of totalization here, that language is given all at once, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of Condon and this article that I put in the chat about neonate movement is synchronized with adult speech. So what Condon did was he took very fast pictures of people, and he found out that when people talk to each other, they do micro movements along with the speech of the other and themselves. So one part of your body would move to the paragraphs, another would move to the sentence, another would move to the body, the words, another to the phonemes. And what they found was that the movements would change. In other words, what part of the body kept track of what part of the speech would change, but the body would continue tracking the speech of the other. And then they did this to babies, and they found out that a baby laying in the corner where other people are already talking did exactly the same thing. The different parts of their body kept track of the different parts of speech as they're spoken. So this wholeness of language seems to be built in at a biological level. And so that's why I think that they can, Deleuze can make the claim that language is given all at once, whereas knowledge is a piecemeal thing that we acquire part by part. And so that's that's the difference there that he's trying to draw our attention to.
I think that's how I'm reading it as well. So when we deal with language all at once, because by taking part in it, and as we've talked about, I think it's in a handful of series before, the assumption of any proposition is there is a innate assumption of sense making, just by the nature of sort of taking part in that structure. By doing so, the assumption of taking part in that structure, the assumption of sense making, is where language lives. And the only way that you can have language in that sort of setup is when you have, basically, as it exists, this entire signifying series that you are learning bit by bit. That's the signified. You're learning pieces, words here and there. But in order to do so, there has to be an assumption, a knowledge, a belief that there is an absolute totality that all-encompassing. In theory, you could eventually know everything and everything makes sense. I'm not saying you can, but I'm saying like there has to be that assumption innate to it. Law exists only when you sort of assume that all of it together fits as a nice set of pieces. That's law comes all at once. Language comes all at once. These things come all at once because by taking part in the system itself, you are by nature taking part in the entirety of the system as it exists. And that's the signifying series on that side. Well, the signified is part to part in the order of the known. My life, basically my direct life experience and things that I do and as I learn, that becomes the signified.
So Brooks, if I can cut in here, I think I heard you saying earlier that for you this whole notion comes off a bit transcendental, and now hearing you say this, I think I'm even closer to kind of catching what you mean, because what you expressed was that the importance for the totality is that there is like an implied belief or a possibility or something, and that to me sounds like, yes, it's like a Kantian regulative idea, right? I read it perhaps Deleuze somewhat differently as really just making an ontological claim. It's not even necessary to sort of think of it as like a propositional belief. No, like it's not, and it is given as such in its unquestionable totality. Therefore, it's not founded in a propositional attitude of the speaker, not or necessarily, Does that make any sense? Sorry.
No, I think it helps a little bit. So I don't want to get too mired on this because I know I'm just having more of a difficulty doing this.
Could I just say something here? What Condon's research suggests is that the totality is our bodies in relationship to language as we absorb it from our surroundings. It's not out there in the world somewhere, this totality. It's in our response to the language at a level where our body is reacting to it and we don't even know.
So I'm going to read Alyosha's comment because I think we had Jan or Jan. I'm sorry. Is it Jan?
Either is fine, thank you.
I'll go with Jan. Jan and Kent, I think Alyosha's point sort of converges with yours, so I'm just going to read it, if that's okay with you, Alyosha. I think we're maybe starting in reverse. The point is, wherever two series are in relation, we already have something that looks like a structure. Structures do not use series, but emerge from them. But structure is not some completely determined thing where all of its points are mapped out. This is what we've been over before with the recursive paradoxes. There aren't just two series perfectly mapped to each other. Even Levi Strauss recognized this. There is a necessary slippage, which is governed by an element which belongs to neither or both series, thus the triadic nature of structure, as he says in the Desert Islands essay. As such, the law can never fully totalize, even though it is totalizing or claims to be. As he says, the floating signifier is both the servitude of all infinite thought, but also the very possibility of art, poetry, and even revolution. We do not need to look outside the structure to imagine where change comes in or to understand its ontogenesis, because it is itself the ongoing ramifying resolution of a problematic itself, never static, but sort of conditional at every stage. That actually helps a great deal, Alyosha. so I'll come back to that because I want to go into the floating signifier and signifieds, which is kind of the next bit of this, which is, as we've been talking, the esoteric words, for example, or objects, which he uses in here, and I want to make sure we get to the concept of exoteric object as part of that, which I think is really interesting. So on the one hand, we have a floating signifier and a floating signified. It, something, gadget, mana, is a value that may take on any sense, which would function to fill in the gap between the signifier and signified. It is this empty space in the middle that has sort of two sides to it. It's an occupant as an excess, and non-situated without a place. A displaced place without an occupant is an excess, and a non-situated thing given an occupant with a place is lacking. They're two sides of the same, essentially the same thing, the floating signifier / signified. This entire conception really messed with me last night, but I did like the example he gave, aside from how we went through esoteric words. But the idea of the adventure in the sheep shop, I think, is worth going over as a little bit of the example of this. Through the Looking Glass, Alice ends up in the sheep's shop, where it sort of was the queen a moment ago, and then as the more Alice looks at things, or specifically at the queen, she turns into a sheep, and then now she's in a shop, and the more Alice looks at anything and really starts like diving in, things get more and more strange or more and more unexpected. The sheep shop becomes that thing of chasing the thing on the shelf that every time you reach it goes to a higher shelf until it goes essentially through the ceiling. This inability to grab it. This is the floating signifier and signified, essentially the esoteric words that we just went over last week. Is this a decent summation of that? Because this took me like an hour and a half last night with Cold Circle.
I mean, I think in this paragraph, I think there's a lot of repetition of what's already been said, but it's said in terms of Levi Strauss's terms, in a sense. So Levi Strauss brings in this notion of the floating signifier. That's a quote. I take it from something he said, and then from that, Deleuze then names something the floated signified. So this is a kind of an idea, but then he goes into this this notion of the thing, like the a-liquid, so the gadget and whatnot, something a-liquid, some things that are the abstract things that are kind of there but absent at the same time. And again, this is this is something that Deleuze has already talked about, I would say. And again, he said, and then he quotes from Levi Strauss, the symbolic value 0. So again, he's talking about this abstract thing that the thing that is between the two, that has that kind of function of bringing the two series together.
Yeah, the example from previous sections that I think works really nicely here is we have the purloined letter, and that idea of having basically the two series. You have on the one side the king, the queen, and the minister who ultimately steals the letter, and then you have the second half, which is the signified, the second series, which is I believe at that point it is the police being duped, the minister hiding thing in plain sight, and then Dupont, who comes in to do the switcheroo. The unique part of this, by talking about this sort of secondary thing with this excess / lack and how it operates, the letter ends up having that. The letter very much does, inside the story place, have this sort of natural, I don't know, the thing that functions. It's got a value, it fills the gap, it's absolutely empty. We never find out actually what the value of the letter is. It's actually kind of important, we never do, and so it has an emptiness, but it fills the gap between the two, despite being essentially a total zero symbolically, which is really interesting.
I think I just thought actually. I think the idea of this is what I was trying to understand. Actually, the idea of the Lacan paradox is that it's basically, I think, a homogeneous series. So the two series are united by the same thing, that is the letter. But I think in this example is given here, this is a heterogeneous series. So nature, language and nature, or the universe, are two different things which are brought together in two series. And I think this is why it has this character of this a liquid abstract character. So it's not a definite thing. So it's a gadget or a whatnot or something. Yeah, and then he goes on. I mean, I think the key is at the end of that paragraph, because he says one is characterized by excess and the other by lack. And what is in excess is an empty square, an always displaced place without an occupant, and that's like the shelf in the sheep shop. And what is lacking signifies is supernumerary, non-situated, given, unknown, an occupant without a place. So these are the same thing, but from different sides. Through which
it becomes like, just as a quick example, a law and, let's say, anti-littering legislation. As a quick example, law by nature has a part of it that is this empty square, an always displaced place without an occupant. There's nothing that it's always displaced when you try to find it and try to chase down what the law is. You're never actually able to put your finger on it and say, that's the fucking thing. There's always that. However, also with that, it comes with the very particular law we're talking about, the anti-littering legislation. It works in a very different way. It is an occupant, but it doesn't have a place. It doesn't have a larger sort of system that it's a part of. It's just the thing. And that lack, combined with the excess of possibility or openness that the law has, those things together ultimately become this really odd thing that ultimately plays, like we were talking about last night, as the zipper sort of that allows us to have a signified relationship and keeps them connected between them.
But they never meet, though. That's the thing. They're connected by this a-liquid, the a-liquid. But
sorry, it's aliquid. It's Latin, but I mean Latin is a dead language, so aliquid is fine as well. But technically, it's like aliquid. It means anything or something.
Yeah, it means technically something. I think actually, like that ineffable something. But yeah, we've been pronouncing it wrong the whole time. You'll get used to that. I thought pronunciation in every language. You'll get used to it.
Yeah, we're using a liquid. I think anyway. So I think what also it's interesting. So he's taught the excess is he talks about it as an empty square, and I think that's a relation. That's a reference to something like a chessboard or something like that. And because I know later on he talks about games, and what he's lacking is something extra, a non-situated, something given, but it's not situated. So there's a place where it might go, and the thing that is without a place. And these are the two excess, one excess and one lack that these two series have. But like I say, this is a repetition of what he's already said, but obviously within the context of Levi Strauss. But I think with the aim of now saying what a structure is, and when I read the word structure, I always think of structuralism, which obviously Deleuze is counted as a post-structuralist.
I'd like to mention, you mentioned chess, and so I think the chess move kind of exemplifies what we're talking about here, because in a configuration of the board, if you move a piece to an empty square, then you can just move it freely. But if you move a piece to a square that's already occupied, then you get this kind of paradox that the piece is an excess over the place, and the place, is non-empty. And so an exchange takes place where you displace the other piece. And so that's how you resolve the excesses, is by taking the other piece. The excesses and lacks get resolved by taking the other piece.
Well, and it's, I think, worth mentioning, because I dove deep a bit into a little bit of old Mauss and Levi Strauss with the term mana, because we wanted to sort of figure out, like, I don't know, it's been a while. But the idea of mana being originally used as the thing within a gift from the book, The Gift. It's the magical properties that the gift has that will assure, and has the power to assure, that more will be returned upon the sender. Not karma. Karma's cosmic and sort of hyper-transcendental, but mana being the thing that the gift is imbued with, that sort of excess. Really, I just felt like it was important to bring that up, because it's a really amazing example of specifically what they're talking about. When you have the signification, on the one side you have the signifier, where it's the society and the way the society works, the laws, and then the gap, and then there's me giving a gift, why I'm giving it. The thing that connects them is this ineffable, odd thing with, emptiness, or it's the gift, which is as he goes on to say, the exoteric object, but it's mixed with the mana, which is the esoteric word, which gives it this odd place of finding a way to bridge or connect my giving to that larger law, and keeping that sort of structure in place and having that structure between things. The mana is an amazing sort of use of it.
Yeah, so because it could be like as you say, the esoteric word, a thing that brings the two sides, the two series together. And
usually he actually ends by saying it is both word and object at once. So usually it's a thing. Maybe object might be the wrong word, but like it's a thing as well as the esoteric word, and that's the part that I think is really interesting when you start combining. We were going through like old films or current films and talking about like how it's used to sort of stitch together series, like the idea of how the letter is used in the purloined letter, which is itself both the way it's spoken of, the letter as this pronoun and very specific thing, has a nature of the esoteric, but the object itself is exoteric. It's exceptionally banal. The nature of the gift would be the same thing. Or I was mentioning the movie Snatch, where it's the diamond, but they have a specific name that they call it. It's like the big white or something like that, which is a silly, stupid word, but the object itself is completely exoteric. There is a nature in this that combines those two, which I thought was very interesting as he talks about the differentiator and the emission of singularities, but that those two tend to go together, because again, we've got the hyper-specific signified, and then we've got the signifier on the other side, which is pretty incredible. It's a really sort of interesting way to sort of talk through that, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I think it's a good point, because previously he's talked about the esoteric word, so that's the thing through which the two series will communicate, the two heterogeneous series will communicate. And as the end of the next paragraph, the exoteric object is now is added to that esoteric word. So it's another thing. It's the other side. It's the two uneven sides. One might have the what might be the esoteric word, and the other side might be the exoteric object.
Yeah, and just for definition's sake, because I had to really dive in and find out, the esoteric has traditionally always meant for few, a select group of people who are able to know this thing. Exoteric is the opposite. It's intended to be basically everyone knows this, or everyone grasps this, or knows what this thing is. A gift of the briefcase in Pulp Fiction is a good example Cold Circle had, where it's this esoteric. If you haven't seen it, you don't know that there's that glowy thing inside, and the way that they talk about it, they refer to it as the "do you have it?" like they refer to it as it throughout. But it's just a fucking briefcase, and that's kind of the sort of ongoing sort of joke. But the esoteric word and exoteric object combination being a good example of the two sides of the floating signifier and signified, it feels like there's a really fun sort of set of discussions to have around that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's developing that notion, the notion of a series, and developing it now into this idea of structure. So that's the next paragraph. So he talks about structure, and he gives three conditions, three minimal conditions for a structure in general. So the first one is there must be at least two heterogeneous series, which is one shall be a signifying, the other signified. But and he also says a single series never suffices to form a structure.
Yeah, and I think the part the word he uses here, and I know it's the English word, but it's the word shall be determined. Not has to be or must be, but shall, because there's an automatic sort of nature to this as we're processing series. Say two heterogeneous series or more, we like naturally one shall be determined as signifying the other signified. Because at the very end here, not to jump too far ahead, he says the line I'm trying to find where I can cut. In short, it has the function of bringing about the distribution of determining as signifying the series in which it appears in excess, and signified the series in which correlatively lacking. Above all, of assuring the bestowal of sense in both signifying and signified series. For sense is not to be confused with signification. It is rather what is attributed in such a way that it determines both the signifier and signified as such. That's a crazy, like that's a really that feels like a really important thing, I guess I would say, since ultimately is what determines signifier and signified and makes things function. Sense is the impetus. I don't see how else I could read that. Sense is the impetus.
I think we need to understand why he brings in the notion of structure. What is the point of saying that this is a structure? And I think from that understanding will come the final paragraph.
Fair. I just thought it was interesting. We'll get to that. We'll get to the final paragraph. The second thing, because I think you're right. The second thing is the terms of each series are only able to exist through the relations they maintain with one another. To these relations, or rather to the values of these relations, there correspond very particular events, that is, singularities, which are assignable within said structure. The situation is very similar to that of calculus, and he goes into math shit that my brain fries at. But the very short thing is that the singularities correspond to the values of those relations. A structure has its distribution of points, and so ultimately structure includes a history of ideal events. The history internal to it. The example he gives, and I think it's almost a direct reference to what we were talking about earlier with story points, with characters. The series, it is a history which connects all the singular points corresponding to the positions of the characters relative to one another in the two series. Almost like the idea as I'm reading a book, or I'm reading the purloined letter, the series as it progresses and as the two are beginning to sort of take shape, as sense makes them and sense chooses, one is being signifier, one is signified. Between the two, they connect, they have their history pointing at each other, talking to each other. That is necessary as the second step of a structure. And it includes all of those points of distribution.
Yeah, I think it's beginning to talk about, reading this paragraph, which I find difficult to understand, but I think he's beginning to. So the structure kind of is it's that with it contains the series and how the series then interact with each other through these singularities or single points, which I think has a relationship to the mathematical thing he's talking about.
Yeah, there's a nice analogy there, or maybe I'm misconstruing it in my own mind, helped along by the fact that I have a fairly moderate grasp of the mathematics behind differential calculus. But it seems like he's making an analogy between the singularities implied in differential calculus and the singularities between different signifiers within the Saussurean take on language.
Yeah. So is what you're saying? So in differential calculus, something like a curve is made up of a series of infinite number of points that join together.
Well, each of those potentially infinite points can be conceived of as a singularity, and then the relationship between those two can be conceptualized as a singularity. At which point, differential calculus becomes a structure, or something akin to a structure. But then I guess the idea is like. Maybe again I have this sort of malformed sense of it, but I look at it almost like, okay, so you determine the inflection point of a certain curve at a distinct point. You use differential calculus to determine that. You only do that for that particular point, for that particular segment of the curve, and it's actually an infinitesimal point. Therefore, like this occurrence, this calculation, or this sort of a meeting of and perfect determination within the sort of context of differential calculus of the integral of a curve, that would be that would basically be like a singular event. Therefore, it would be a singularity. Or I guess that's the way I sort of analogy for myself.
Yeah. So each singularity is a point on a curve, though they joined up to create the curve. And then he talks about, he then uses the example of language. So he says just trying to find it, the phonemes. And then the differential relation among phonemes, which I take phonemes as sounds, the basic sounds, but I don't know, there might be something different, fundamental sounds. They assign singularities within language. So language spoken, when we speak in an endless connection of sounds, which when brought together, they signify. That's how we speak. The sonorities, the sounds that we make, the words and significations are characteristic. So he's connecting differential calculus with language, and this is a kind of very typical of Deleuze, who's obviously is a very interesting notion of difference, and one of the ways he talks about it is through differential mathematics. Correspond to the base series. And for that reason, it's really imprecise to oppose structure and event. The structure includes a register of ideal events. That is an entire history internal to it.
in the meantime, we can actually going a bit deeper into the way that differential calculus can be understood here as being a good example of this sort of notion of the singular, you know, and it being a sort of underdetermined. We can distinguish three types of relation. A first type is established between elements which enjoy independence or autonomy. For example, 3 plus 2 or even 2 divided by 3. The elements are real, and these relations must themselves be said to be real. A second type of relationship, for example, x times 2 plus y times 2 minus r2 equals 0, is established between terms for which the value is not specified, but which in each case, however, must have a determined value. Such relations can be called imaginary. But the third type is established between elements which have no determined value themselves and which nevertheless determine each other reciprocally in the relation. Thus, and I'm not really sure how to parse this, but y dy plus x dx equals 0, or dy dx equals x divided by 0, or x over 0, or the negation thereof. Okay, such relationships are symbolic, and the corresponding elements are held in a differential relationship. dy is totally undetermined, and dx is totally undetermined in relation to x. Each one has neither existence nor value nor signification, and that yet the relation totally determined, and the two elements determining each other reciprocally in the relation. This process of a reciprocal determination is at the heart of a relationship that allows one to define the symbolic nature. So there is a degree to which here Deleuze senses something of like a pure relation with no fixed elements underlying it, and yet the relationship can be expressed as a fixed determination that just sort of floats around, you know, without any fixed points to settle it down. And then whenever this fixedness also becomes realized, so to speak, in actual determined elements, perhaps that is when we can speak of a singularity. Maybe.
All right, I'm maybe having some audio issues. If anyone on YouTube is listening, just type and say if it sucks or not. Is my audio coming through to you guys okay in the room?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Yeah, it's good on the recording too. I don't know what's going on. YouTube is being funny. I'll have to spend some time figuring that out later. All right. Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
I think we should mention that the this analysis of structuralism based on series is, I think, kind of unique to Deleuze. I haven't seen it anywhere else. And so he's thinking both about the the structure of language and structuralism at the same time through these series. And then he's thinking it through more carefully than I think people had thought about it before, because other people had come up with the idea of the floating signifier, but he says that there's an opposite of that, which is the floated signified. And so he's thinking through these dualities that are implied in the structural way of looking at things. And so, I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, because I think number three, the third condition for a structure, kind of develops that idea. So he says the two heterogeneous series converge towards a paradoxical element, which is their differentiator. And last week we talked about the paradoxical element as the esoteric word. So, but he's saying this is the principle of the emission of singularities. This is a new idea that's been brought in, this notion of singularities. So that was in the previous, in number 2, but this is again, it is repeated into number 3, the principle of the emission of the singularities. And he says this element belongs to no series, it belongs to both series that wants to never cease to circulate through them. But that's also the definition of the esoteric word.
So I think one thing we should be careful about is that when he says singularity, he doesn't mean like what's at the center of a black hole. He means I think a better word might be singular points versus normal points. So in calculus, it's the points of deflection. They're singular points where some change occurs to the changes.
Yeah, I think
if you're drawing a line and the line gets deflected, the point of deflection is what he's calling a singularity or a singular point.
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's not, for example, a defect where there's nothing there, for instance.
Yeah, and he says that this belongs to no series. It belongs to both series at once, never cease to circulate through them. And again, he's describing a series in this section. Again, he's describing the series the way he's talked about it previously, but I think he's expanding it to include this notion of singularity. And as we've already said, he brings in the exoteric object alongside the esoteric word. He says it has a property of always being displaced in relation to itself and being absent from its own place. And we had that again previously with the idea of the sheep, the example of the sheep shop when Alice was looking at the shelf, and whenever she looked at something, it was always not where it was, and it kind of moves up through the ceiling. And he says has a property of always being displaced in relation to itself, being absent from its own place. And again, he talks
Now, my
about
sense of things at this point is that in the paradoxical element, basically also the the floating signified and the floating signifier somewhat converge, or rather, like the two different series converge towards it, and to some degree we can. I mean, maybe I'm just proposing here. Like, can we identify this paradoxical element with both the floating signified and the floating signifier?
I would. It's tempting, so it might be right. Yeah.
Right, it is tempting, and that's why I utter it, even though I'm not quite so sure whether, it can, like that identification can be made so easily.
Can, any chance you can expand a little bit on that, just for me?
Right. So, at an earlier point, we're talking about the floating signifier, the servitude of all finite thought, also the promise of all art, etc., etc. And on the other side of that, and then obviously like the floating signified given by the signifier without being thereby known, without being thereby assigned or realized.
Yeah, I think
And
reading it. Sorry.
oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to continue what you're saying, really, because I think just reading that section again, because he talks about the excess in one and the lack in the other,
Exactly. Yeah.
One,
Yeah. So
one can,
it's an excess on the side of one series, a lack on the side of the others, but perhaps it converges. And at the point of convergence, we find the paradoxical element.
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, but,
And I think what happens there is that once one series has an excess, the other series has a lack, but where they intersect, there's this complementary change where the one that has the lack gets an excess and the one that has the excess gets a lack at that point. But that point bifurcates into the floating signifier and the floated signified. And I'll give you an example, I think, of the floated signified. Like, for instance, in the tetralemma in Buddhism, what they say is that it's, it's not a, both, and neither. Then they say emptiness is something else. So you have all of the logical elements and their combinations, and the Buddhists are saying, or Nagarjuna is saying, emptiness is something else than that. And so I'd say that's an example of a floated signified. It really doesn't have a place.
I think it's floating signifies one half. So it's the signifier. It has an excess, which is the floating signifier, and the signified has a lack, which Deleuze kind of calls the floating signified. But it's something he's already talked about previously. But he's again at the bottom of page 652, he says that there are two uneven sides, and by means of which the series communicate, but without losing their difference. So the series don't merge into one. I think he's talking about the difference between the two series. They don't become the same. It allows them to communicate. The excess and the lack allow this communication to take place. So, and then to go on over to page 53, the end of that, number 3. He's talking about the thing that's absent from its own place appears in one of the series as an excess, but only in the condition that it would appear at the same time and the other as a lack. So it's this thing that has this lack. There's two sides to it, which is an excess in one and a lack in another. If it is an excess in one, it is so as an empty square, and if it is lacking the other, so as a supernumerary pawn or an occupant without a compartment. So one, there is a space that has not been filled, a space that will take something that has not been filled. And the other side, there is something, an object that is there, but it has got no place for it to go. And he says and then he calls them by the name, esoteric word, an exoteric object, which I take it that the esoteric word is the signified and the excess, and the exoteric object is the lack of the signifier. The question is, I think, is it one thing? Is this esoteric stroke exoteric? Is this esoteric object stroke exoteric object a thing that's separate from the two? Because in the example of Lacan's letter, the letter is separate from the two series, but it's a homogeneous series. Where here, it's the signify and signify give off these things. They're not. But yeah, then somehow they're given off, and they are like what's given off are the two. They make up two sides of an object.
So to me, it's a matter of. I hope my audio is okay. Goddamn. To me, the way he says it is that it's actually part of both series. It's an element in both. So it's because the letter, for example, is part of the relations of both series in the purloined letter. It's something that absolutely is about how they're how we find the connection between them is through the letter. How we sort of define them is the relationship to the letter. Really, it's the police getting kerfluffled by not being able to find it, the king completely bypassing it, being in plain sight, the queen and the minister hiding it. Like, their relations is through this paradoxical object. But the object itself has no content, has no symbolic value of its own. So it's in both series, and it is displaced itself. As he says, it circulates through the two series, appearing as excess in one and lack in another. So letter itself is very much that. It's an excess in the signifier and a lack in the signified, because it has a larger power for one series for the other because of what its implications are and how it sort of exists within a larger symbolic structure. So the answer is both to me.
Yeah, and it's nice that the paradoxical element also displays this quality of belonging to no series, or rather belonging to both series at once, which is like an overt paradox as well.
So when you take a piece in chess, it goes off the board. So and what's interesting is that interaction by which the taken piece goes off the board is an event. So here you can see this trading of deficiencies and surpluses that happens when you take when you take a piece in chess. It performs a kind of trade, and it throws one piece off the board, and so it becomes this floated signifier.
And then the final paragraph kind of brings it all together. So he's talking about this, the differentiator, I suppose, I presume. He said it has the function of articulating the two series to one another, of reflecting them in one another, of making them communicate, coexist, and be ramified. I think this notion of articulation is quite important, because if you think about I think it's used this word before, so it's almost like it's like a hinge. It's a thing that articulates them towards each other, and so they reflect that end of reflecting them in one another. So it's kind of, again, it's an idea. Here is an idea of reflection, making them communicate, coexist, so they're there at the same time, and be ramified. So they're kind of they're branching off. I'm trying to think of the right word, ramified, in terms of make more and more complex in their kind of relationship. But then he brings to this new idea that, again, it's this notion of singularities, which was talked about earlier, in terms of a kind of the point of change as a function of joy and singularity correspond to two series in a tangled tale of assuring the passage from one distribution of singularity to the next.
And it's just a very interesting way of talking about how sense works within storytelling, within our lived stories, how we go through society, what we do, how we discuss stuff. It's almost impossible for me not to directly point at stuff within AO, and this feels like a lot more of a direct sort of call out of some of those concepts, how we find meaning, how we develop it, how representation works, how we play within that. It feels like a direct call out in that direction, this last bit especially. The idea that sense is not to be confused with signification. It is rather what is attributed in such a way that it determines both the signifier and signified as such. There is no structure without series, without relations between the terms of each series, or without singular points corresponding to those relations. But there is no structure without the empty square. It's a really sort of amazing take on what structure is. To me, I don't know. I found this to be just like really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's worth reading through that in detail. So you're going back to page 53, the bottom of page 53. So again, I think he's talking about this differentiator, what it's previously called a paradoxical object. which is now made up of an esoteric word and exoteric object. It has the function of bringing about distribution of singular points. That's its first function. So these singular points are these points of inflection. Secondly, a determining is signifying the series in which it appears in excess. So it then says which of the two series is signifying. I would say that I read that as it determines a signifier series which appears in excess. So where this paradoxical or this differentiator appears, through that you know which of the series is the one that signifies, and conversely you then know which is signified, which is signifying, and which is signified, and which because it's lacking. And then it also assures the bestowal of sense in both on both of those series. So, and as you're saying, Brooke, sense is not signification. Rather, it is rather what is attributed in such a way that it determines both the signifier and the signified as such. So again, this has this structure. It seems to have this structure of bestowing the idea of being in such a way, so it determines both the signified as such. So the sense says which is the signifier and which is the signified.
Yeah, it belongs to both series, but also to neither at the same time. Like I use the term zipper, and I think I'm going to continue to, because I kind of like that way that it works. It's not that the two sides of the jacket actually touch. The zipper is the one that sort of does the connecting. But the nature of this is that this thing is that which not only points to the different points and sort of distributes them along each series and becomes that thing that sort of is pointing at them, but also the sort of reason that we're able to compare and contrast the two heterogeneous series in and of themselves even. And because the nature of one of them, because sense immediately assigns one as the signifier and the other as the signified, it happens as we go. The object appears early and late. It has excess in one as an empty square, but in the other it's an object of banal, exoteric. Yeah, who cares? Like, who gives a shit? It's so boring. Somehow at the same time. And that's the nature of it. I kept saying this last night, it's MacGuffin. Like, it's the MacGuffin, the reason for events, the drive forward, the excuse we have for things. The Death Star plans in Star Wars, the boring little chip things. That's not the point. The point isn't the Death Star plans, but they are this larger thing that's happening because it's part of this larger story. The Ark of the Covenant and Indiana Jones, these things that have this, esoteric aspect to them, but they're just banal objects that sort of are part of both series, but ultimately distribute the points between them and allow us to have one as the signifier and the other as the signified. It's a really interesting way to think through how the structure of story works. And then, of course, as he talks about as well, the political side of this and the implications there. It essentially is us doing the same thing we do with stories, but it's the nature of how we think about large-scale, to me, the socius. This is the socius, they would come to call this, that the rules that society has, the laws, the way things are. It's the BWO of society. And that exists as a collective miasma, very specific things, but they're signifiers. They're not really things. And then my actual existence and how I sort of integrate that and how I relate them tends to be through paradoxical elements of, for the law, it's the policeman's badge, the shield, as they call it, the shield. And to me, that's an esoteric word and boring fucking exoteric object that is able to play both with citizenry in my everyday life as well as the concept of law. That series. It's an interesting way to sort of think and break down that structure. Or don't also. The political implications feel direct from AO. Like, this feels very direct, sort of pointing towards all of that. And it's a really interesting thing, again, when we're building on this order that he's put the series in. And there's no way he's not deliberate in how he's going through this. We've talked through the idea of how the sort of essence of paradox and how denotation breaks, how signification breaks, all these things that insist upon other parts. And now that we're at the part where we've got now the series, which is a series of propositions, now we've combined a bunch of those. It's either homogeneous or heterogeneous. Two heterogeneous, like a homogeneous series doesn't need structure. A homogeneous series is just kind of a homogeneous series. It's the same shit. Two heterogeneous series, we need to be able to integrate them, to think about them. And in order to do that, we need this esoteric word, exoteric object, this thing that is at the same time part of both, but also neither, that's able to point to both at the same time, but is both an empty location, but also a place without a location, which is a really interesting thing that in order to have heterogeneous series we're able to marry, we've got to have a paradox as part of it. Like, that's a...
And also, like, at the point where it's a heterogeneous series, would that not imply, given this last paragraph, or the second to last paragraph, that it would actually already be two series? Or rather, right, like, if you have the paradoxical element, you have a heterogeneity in your series, you can also conceptualize it as two different series, and the paradoxical element circulating between them.
It feels like it's, yeah, to me, it's structure all the way down kind of moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just going back to that last paragraph, I think I kind of misunderstood it, because I think I was thinking it was referring to this paradoxical element or differentiator, whereas I think it's saying the structure has a function. The structure functions by articulating the two series. I think that's what it's saying. I might be wrong. I was trying to think what the it refers to at the beginning of the last paragraph. It has the function, and I think it means the structure in which the series and the singularities and the differentiator are placed. They're all placed within this structure, and as a structure, it functions by. And we've already been through this. So the two series articulating one to another, and then joining the singularities, which correspond to two series, and brings about disparate singular points, and signifying which is the signifying series, which is the signified, and also the sense, the dispute sense, which is attributed to it determines which of the two is the signifier and which is signified. And he says, from this, there's no structure without series, without relation between the terms of the series, or without singular points. So all these things are essential to any structure. But he says also any structure, what it needs is this empty square, this thing, this abstract thing, which going back to what you said earlier about Levi Strauss, he talks about the manner. So within a kind of primitive society, you have this notion of gift giving, and this gift has a power, and it's called manner.
Yeah, I really love this methodology a lot. Sorry, Kent, go ahead.
No, I didn't have anything to say. But we could say, to get broader context of that, structuralism has been very successful in physics, because that's Mendeleev's table is a structural exercise, for instance, of the elements, and the quark table is another example of a structure. And so what we're talking about here is a very successful method that was applied in physics and, say, mathematics, that's now being applied to the humanities and culture.
I'm still thinking about like taking the last paragraph and taking the it to refer to structure itself. I actually, I mean, I think I've read this part over a dozen times over the course of my life. It never occurred to me to take it as referring to structure. I'd always just read it in continuity with the part previous to it, where constantly there's reference to like the paradoxical element. But then, yeah, there is a paragraph break there, and the previous paragraph starts with it starts talking about a structure.
Yeah, it
And
makes more
then
sense.
and then this reading would also kind of make me think about like structure as a function. All right, the paragraph says structure has the function, but then when we're talking about the function of structure, that's an interesting concept for me as well. Like and then structure as a particular type
Yeah, I think it
of
makes sense
function.
because
He also wrote an article about what is structure, where he makes it explicit that, when he talks about these series and structure, he's doing a take on structuralism.
I really dig this a lot. All right.
Mm.
As we're nearing, we've got probably about 20 minutes left. Does anyone have questions or comments about this at this point? Any last thoughts? I'm hoping if anyone else has questions around anything inside of this one, because as we start moving into the ninth series of the problematic, it's incredibly important that, again, because of how this book is structured, it is the first series gets enveloped by the second, gets enveloped by the third, and it kind of is this layered cake of a book. If there's any questions around structure, how it works, how excess and lack sort of put forward. If there's not, I would like to dive immediately into fun examples of such things, if anyone has any, because I think examples are really fun to talk about with all this stuff. So be thinking of those. Does anyone have questions, though, about any of the wording, any of the comments, any of the lines inside of this that they're curious about or wondering? I'm going to take that as a no. I will take that as a no. Fair enough. Fair enough. I went through a handful of examples because I was going through like old MacGuffin movies and things. But one of the signified sort of setups inside of film, which I think we had a lot of fun going through a few examples. Pulp Fiction being a great one. Obviously, Snatch being another wonderful one of probably it's 5 total heterogeneous series of characters and interactions that only get really tied together via the diamond that they've stolen. That kind of is the thing that ties it all together, but it also doesn't necessarily ever actually have value. I know it's a diamond and it's worth a fortune, but it doesn't like itself have any symbolic value. It's an empty object for sure. But because of such a thing, it's able to point everyone in different ways and make how they relate to each other the interesting part. If there's other examples of this, I'd love if you guys have thoughts, because it's a fun sort of dive to go down. I'm happy to ramble for a few more minutes myself, don't worry.
Well, is the point where I just deposit the link to TV tropes and let people do their own sort of wanderings, because I love this concept of the MacGuffin as well as like a generic trope, and there's so many instances of it throughout media in general, and I think like this reading of Deleuze definitely opens up very interesting pathways of thinking about MacGuffins in general.
Yeah, I really dug it. Has some really sort of classic, dumb, stupid shit. The Big Lebowski, it's the rug. It's his rug. It is completely meaningless object. It has less value to everyone, even though it's important. But, it not only ties the room together, which is a fucking great line, because it also ties together the heterogeneous series. There's just so many great little moments like that I thought was, as I started like diving down and going through the tropes of what MacGuffins do and how they play within spaces. But then I came to what is actually my favorite film of all time, and I started thinking through Synecdoche, New York, which is
Oh yeah.
It's a movie about series within series within series, and we're gonna do a viewing of it Friday because we have to. And I'm gonna set that up and do it myself because if you haven't seen the film, it's amazing and it's incredibly important for people on the server. I have no doubt. If you're into this stuff, it's wonderful. But
by the way, by the end of this movie, I'm not sure if this is an endorsement or not, but the first time I watched it, by the end of it, I was bawling.
See, Cold Circle, it's not just me. I cry every time I watch the movie. So I wasn't like exaggerating. Like it is, and it's not like a sadness. It is a release, cathartic.
Yeah, it is cathartic. Yes.
It's a wonderful film, but it is about. There's a few lines in it that came to mind while we were doing this reading last night and again today, which is the phrasing he uses around reciprocally implicated. The laws and rules that are reciprocally implicated, even when they still have no objects. There's a phrase from that film that came to mind that is, the end is baked into the beginning, because implicated, Varun joined us last night, and we were talking through Deleuze's use of the word implicated comes from very similar writings that he did about the egg, and how the egg is implication. The end is built into the beginning, despite having none of the end literally in it. The end is built into the beginning, and that's, if there is a moral of Synecdoche, New York, it is that. Actually, that is the phrase. They say it multiple times literally in the film. The end is built into the beginning, which is I found a wonderful thing. But within that, there is a series of absurd words, absurd esoteric words, and exceptionally boring objects. That it feels like that is actually almost a response to maybe even these 4 pages, where it's just like, cool, let's see how far I can take structure and just melt it into itself over and over. So we're watching that Friday. It's a phenomenal, utterly phenomenal film. But with that, if no one else has anything to add or toss in, I'm going to go ahead and slowly close this out. Any last notes, anything before I shut everything down?
Well, I just wonder, I'm not sure about Kaufman, but perhaps he might have read Deleuze's cinema books.
I'm going to assume he probably did, but maybe. He's an odd cat, and it wouldn't surprise me either way, somehow. But it's hard not to, now that we've been going through AO, and now I'm into this. Synecdoche, New York is like all of Kaufman's films are this. I just did a podcast with a friend of mine where we were reviewing Being John Malkovich, and it's literally, this is that. It's the idea of structure, how we have these heterogeneous series, how we combine them, how sense passes through them. I'm no longer going to say how sense is produced by them, because that's not the case. But the wording, the emotion, I think is right, but it's not strictly accurate. So it's a really interesting thing. We'll get through synecdoche. Any other last notes before I close out? And with that, I will say thank all of you for joining us on this lovely Monday. As always, you can find us YouTube, Twitter, Patreon, all sorts of fun places. I don't post on Instagram because I decided I hate it. And if anyone wants to post on Instagram for us, let me know. I'll give you access. I don't really care. And with that, I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you so much.